OpenAI at the moment is not very open about what's going on. What's going on, Nikos? What's happening
Yeah,
with closed AI?
yeah. Everything that's going on around AI and the company that's like right at the forefront of all of these things, you really don't get a sense of what's going on inside the company, especially if it happens at the board level.
Their biggest investor, Microsoft, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, was not even aware. He was made aware 10 minutes before the news hit the tape.
WTF, guys? Like what's going on here? This came completely from left field, and I think that's why it rocked the entire tech industry, which is super interesting.
There's a lot of people that have come by his side saying, this is absolutely unacceptable and we need more transparency.
You would think at that high level, you get the media training, you have public policy experts, communication experts that have like master's degrees, and now you have everybody on the hook, just like eating popcorn, right? Like, what? It's like, okay.
Welcome. Nikos, how are you?
Good, man. Well rested and ready to rock.
It's essential to just switch off
Yeah,
and come back with your batteries recharged.
definitely.
So, I've been thinking a lot about you because there's a lot happening in the world of AI.
That's right.
A lot.
Yeah, yeah.
So, OpenAI at the moment is not very open about what's going on. What's going on, Nikos? What's happening
Yeah,
with closed AI?
yeah. It's super interesting, right? Just a major announcement that hit and rocked the tech world. Obviously, with Sam Altman just doing all of these speaking gigs, and he was just at the forefront in the limelight, very much the OpenAI evangelist, very much a proponent of everything that they're doing around AI. So this came a bit of a shocker, that the board had essentially just fired Sam Altman, said that he wasn't being transparent with the board about certain issues. And, a lot of this is going to be speculation, but that's essentially what the headline is. And so it was a weekend. And so they dropped the news essentially on a Friday
Mm,
and expecting news not to pick it up. But now you're basically just infuriating a lot of the journalists because now they have to come in over the weekend to cover the story, right? And so now there's talks
mm.
about, because the backlash was so bad, and I'm just encapsulating everything that happened in the last 72 hours or so. And now there's even talks about Sam kind of coming back, right? So open talks with the board about coming back. So that's just the most abstracted view of it. I'm not going to go through like all of the tweets, but I thought it would be a good thing to talk about just because, you know, e- everything that's going on around AI and the company that's like right at the forefront of all of these things, you really don't get a sense of what's going on inside the company, especially if it happens at the board level. And I figure we could attribute this to kind of the core of what it means to be aligned as a board. And you probably have great thoughts around this as well. But if there's disagreement at the core level, and 4 out of the 6 members of the board decide to fire Sam Altman, who's created all kinds of value for the company, Microsoft,
92 billion
92
or
billion.
75 to 80 billion to be
That's
precise.
right, in valuation, and looking at about
Mm,
$1 billion in revenue, both from API utilization and consumption, as well as just subscriptions to the premium offering, which I am a subscriber of. And so you just have to ask a
mm.
lot of questions around what is really going on, and who had prompted the ousting, and what led up to this catalyzing the type of situation that had unfolded over the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, having a board is essential, right? Because it's that counterbalance and it's a reminder that to CEOs that there's accountability, right? There's a group of individuals by way of a board that the CEO is accountable to, right? And and transparency is key, especially if that's the expectation. And like you said, a lot of this is speculation, but the board clearly were not happy. I read that their biggest investor, Microsoft, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, was not even aware. He was made aware 10 minutes before the news hit the tape.
Yeah,
So, uh, yeah, I mean, clearly there's something that had happened behind the scenes that they were not happy about. And it could have been a recurring pattern. And I think this is what happens with CEOs. And it's this is not exclusive. And I'm not referring to Sam Altman because we don't know what really happened. But what happens typically in companies is that CEOs forget that they are accountable to a board, right? And they start seeing things and doing things and may not be reporting or may not be as forthcoming and transparent to the board because they are then, they're running the ship. They're the captain of the ship. They're navigating the business through challenges and opportunities. And was this a communication lapse? Possibly. But then there was a recurring pattern. We don't know, right? Like you said, it's speculation. And the
absolutely.
fact that now, yeah, and as the story is developing, I just saw this morning that there are talks and could be rumors that they're thinking about bringing him back.
Yep.
Do you want to just expand on that?
Yeah. So a couple of the key points there is knowing who the board members are, and so there were some board members that played a key pivotal role in the company, and I'll comment on those folks. I can't really comment on the folks that are playing more of kind of taking more of a back seat, but the one that struck me was and the trinity of OpenAI, right? So it's I'm talking about Sam Altman, Ilya Sutskever, um, who's a co-founder and a researcher and one of the key and leading researchers of OpenAI, and then Greg Brockman, who's also writing code, right? Who's also playing the part of a president, all with very, very extensive, robust resumes in the space, and really, have a solid reputation and pedigree for creating state of the art AI solutions. Sam Altman himself, just being an avid deal maker, coming from Y Combinator and just knowing how to cut good deals. And Microsoft is a really good example of that. But just based on what I'm seeing on X and just a lot of the headlines and reading between the lines, there was probably a rift that was going on, or some kind of misalignment. We talk about AI alignment, but there was probably some misaligned expectations or misaligned reporting or communication between Sam Altman and Ilya Sutskever. And there are, again, speculative assumptions that Ilya was the one that was kind of prompting Sam to get displaced. And immediately following what happened on Friday to Sam Altman, there was a lot of, back and forth going on about just getting him on a Zoom call, and then the board, and then he just appeared on the board. So it was clear that both himself and Greg Brockman were blindsided. But then Brockman himself, after he
Mm.
heard the news, tweeted, "Hey, I love everything that we're doing right now, but I quit." And so those two things, it's kind of like a 1-2 punch with, the trifecta, the trinity of the folks that are running it. And you can't, if you're a board member, if you're an investor, you're a key partner, you're a stakeholder, and you are a leading employee or engineer as part of the leadership committee, you're going to be like, WTF, guys, like what's going on here? This came completely from left field. And I think that's why it rocked the entire tech industry, which is super interesting. And even more interesting that it's like, okay, like, where's the professionalism here? To your point, just to close the loop,
Mhm.
what's interesting about it is, oh, there now talks about him potentially coming back, right? So even though there's probably some interesting things going on about what was misaligned, it could have been about AI safety concerns. It could have been the speed at which Sam Altman had wanted to push product into market without being a little bit more careful about AI safety. It could have been, fiduciary. It could have been about conflicts of interest with various companies, because OpenAI competes directly with Microsoft to that degree. But again, if you have probably the threat of a lot of people pulling a walkout, and you're going to lose a lot of great talent as a result of it, it leads you to believe that, yeah, the board should probably have reconsidered before making kind of that big brash decision. And now we're seeing kind of things start to kind of, well, the dust hasn't settled at all, but we'll probably get an announcement tomorrow or Tuesday about where this is going to fall, and Sam potentially coming back, which sounds like the right move at this time.
Yeah. You know what really sounds interesting, or what really caught my attention with all of this is he put out a tweet about how he was overwhelmed by the love that he was receiving, and it was like reading his own eulogy. And I thought that was really interesting because as I peeled the layers, I found that, you know, on balance, the board was getting a lot more heat and a lot more pressure for this move, more than the commentary around Sam's credibility and reputation. Because he's a really likable guy, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Like, he's well liked in the industry. Uh, and as known for someone who is very forthcoming, very open, very transparent, and that's, you know, credibility that he's built over a probably a couple of decades.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting to me, that, you know, it really comes down to, you know, it's not about what you do in one moment, it's about what you do in moments, you know, in your career, that really determine how people respond when there's really not much information out there, right?
No, totally.
And your credibility and that you've built really then starts coming to save and to help, you know, I don't want to say vindicate, because, you know, there's a lot of assumption in saying that because we don't have information, but just the fact that there's a lot of people that have come by his side saying, you know, this is absolutely unacceptable and we need more transparency.
Well, just the very public mismanagement of perception, which is you would think it at that high level, you get the media training, you have public policy
Yeah.
experts, communication experts that have like master's degrees, and this happens to be some of my expertise around managing perception and having a specific rollout and how you announce and how you announce to employees. For one, there was just no specific reason for Altman's removal that was provided to the public. So now it's like, now you have everybody on the hook, just like eating popcorn, right? Like, it's like, okay, like we're hooked. Like, what's going on? Like, how is this movie going to play
What's
out?
going on?
Not just that, but now resignations, confusion among employees because they're following their fearless leader, and I don't think the board thought through
Mm,
the ramifications of that. And not only that, like there were some board meeting details that came out, right? And again, you get a sense that Skever was the one that kind of prompted this because he did read a statement about Sam Altman's lack of candor, and that could be about his deal making on the side. It could be about a VC fund that he's starting to raise. You also get a sense that like Brockman and Altman, I mean, they're billionaires many times over, right? Like, you think they're concerned about their next opportunity? They're going to start something like immediately after that, and everybody's going to probably jump
yeah.
ship and follow that company. So it's not like, oh, poor Sam, poor Greg. They're like, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
Which is funny because as a play, as a strategic play, you get a sense, like at least we got a sense that Altman and Brockman, they held all the cards in the company as co-founders. But then, okay, maybe they didn't hold all the cards because you know about little things like supermajority voting and those things that can keep you in place. Like Zuckerberg, for instance, can never be fired. Josh James at Domo can never be fired. Things like that, where
Mm,
you have like little bylines in the board of directors agreement or amendments that say that you can't get fired. But it was like, okay, well, I guess he doesn't have control. Maybe they gave it up in equity. And so another piece of that is like the company structure, right? The fact that this is a capped for-profit entity that Microsoft holds 49% equity stake in, but also rolls up to the nonprofit entity, right, of which the
yeah.
board fully controls. That allays some complexity around the structure, and we're exploring that kind of structure too at Dial In, and this is a very good cautionary tale of what to do and what not to do. Good, right? So yeah, Mira Murati, who's essentially placed as the interim CEO, and she was the CTO. Again, not to read too much into it, but since you mentioned it, she did heart that tweet from Sam saying that he loves OpenAI, right? So a lot of people are reading into that as, okay, they seem to be cool, but Sitzkever, he hasn't said anything publicly about this, so he's probably like the Judas, so to speak, around this. So it's high drama, and it's theater, and it's super interesting, right, for everybody in the tech space. So it'll continue to
Yeah.
be more interesting as it unfolds.
There were a couple of tweets that that were hilarious. There was one. Uh, there was one tweet that said the board finally found out that Sam Altman was doing all the responses to all the Chat GPT questions that were coming in, and decided that it was time to let him go. There was another tweet. There was another tweet about how Chat GPT 5 uh, got sentient and
And
decided that it
decided to
was
fire
time
him.
to fire Sam.
Yeah. Yeah, those are
Yeah.
good,
So,
right? So
so
those
like you
are
said,
those
yeah.
are those are fun, but yeah, you're right. So now on the verge of his potential return, there's discussions are ongoing, just because it's like, oh, bad move, like, and you're doing this over a weekend where everybody was just completely blindsided. It's just like, I don't know. You think if you're operating at this high of a level, like, why are certain things like so obviously prudent, but you just kind of ignore it. It's just super interesting that it's happening this way. But here's a question for you, because I've seen it. Like, dysfunction happens at any level, and even at like very mature organizations, you can see some kind of big misses and big mishaps that happen even in hyperscaler companies as large as a Microsoft or an Amazon and AWS or even a Google. It takes place no matter what size of the company, especially in tech where things get complex very, very quickly, and you scale and grow very, very quickly. I saw this at Rocket Fuel. I saw this at Seismic, and a lot of the companies that I've been involved with and consulted with as well. It's interesting how, no matter how large and institutional you get and how much operational process and rigor you put into that company, dysfunction can still happen at any level, no matter how big you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with OpenAI, this is a case study because they started as, like you said, as a nonprofit, and then extended into a for-profit entity, right? So they've got both these entities running in parallel, and the for-profit is generating tremendous profit, right? And so the question is, the board that was put in place, were they put in place before that for-profit entity was set up?
Yeah,
And if so, then the board is very much of that mindset, or come from, you know, uh, their values could be very much aligned with AI being, for good. It needs to be open. It needs to be nonprofit. Now, as the company evolves into something that's very different from what they signed up for, that's going to cause some potential, what's the word that you used?
misalignment,
Dysfunction,
dysfunction, and misalignment. Yeah.
misalignment. Definitely misalignment. Yeah.
Well, it starts with
Because the
misalignment.
incentives are no longer aligned, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It
Yeah,
starts
and
with
so
misalignment. Absolutely.
that's where it gets interesting, especially when you start talking about these major issues around how AI is going to impact humanity, just with respect to AI not having the same goals as humans. And if you're just rushing to get stuff out to market because you need to turn a profit, or free cash flow isn't as good as it seemed, and you're running the books and you're like, wow, this company is just burning through cash. So there are a lot of things that could be at play here in terms of what transparency to the board can cause that kind of misalignment. And also, we know that the reason why I like Ilya Sutskever is that he's kind of the, when it comes to AI safety, he seems to be the researcher that knows the most about the tech and is kind of the adult in the room, right? Like, he's the one
Mm,
that's a little bit more pragmatic and saying, hey, you know what? We're going really, really fast here. Maybe it's not time to release GPT-5 just yet. Let's put the brakes on it. And so you have to kind of feel that out for, it's not just what the market wants, or this is, but essentially, from a macro perspective, it's being treated as an arms race, right? Anything going on with AI,
yeah.
it's like, okay, it may or may not be. And when you have companies that have created the space and have said very, very fortuitous, statements such as, our whole goal is to create AGI, right? Like that in itself should be rocking the entire world. It's like this company just got funded by Microsoft for $10 billion, and their whole goal is to create kind of a sentient intelligence. Like WTF right there. And again, it may not be them. It could be Grok. It could be Anthropic. It could be Mistral. It could be any of these LLMs that came out. We don't know. But
Mm,
it is essentially an arms race, and it feels like it's just getting the age of acceleration is getting faster and faster here. So I'm kind of with Sitskever if the assumption and if the speculation is that there's some misalignment between safety and rolling out product, and Altman was just like kind of pressing forward without taking those safety considerations at the full capacity that they needed to be. Then I tend to side with Sitskever on that, but not to the degree in which you fire the CEO. And again,
mm.
we just don't know what's going on behind the scenes for this to happen. So yeah, all of those things are at play.
All right. So there's a lot that's going to continue to develop, obviously, on that front. We'll keep an eye on it. It's fascinating. Like you said, it's high, high drama, especially for you, given
Yeah,
you're,
yeah.
at the center, at the core of the space.
I am at the edge of my seat. Can't wait to hear what drops
You,
tomorrow. I am absolutely at the edge of my seat.
yeah. Uh, so we wanted to talk about. We've been actually discussing this offline. This concept of first principles thinking. And, I was thinking about this, and you know what really makes me cringe, Nix?
What's that?
When I hear my team or people tell me that, you know, that's just how we've been doing it. That's how we've been doing it. Or that's just how it's always been. Or, um, you know, we've never done it differently before. Or this is how it's always been done.
You think? Oh,
And
your team says they've always been operating under the guise of first principles, is what they're saying.
no, they're saying I'm just speaking in general, wherein, if we're taking a certain approach
Yeah,
on how we go take product to market, or how we decide that we're going to discount certain product lines, you know, the approach has always been, when you actually push back and ask, well, why? Why are we doing that? Right? Or even conversations with friends. I
yeah,
mean, this you know this goes beyond business.
yep,
It actually, you'll see it and hear it across all facets of life, where people say, well, that's just how I've been doing it.
yep.
And this is all I know, right? It's the norm, right? It's the norm.
I see your point.
And
Yeah,
yeah, and the reality is that, it's the norm because we haven't really potentially asked the the question, well, is it really, right? Or is that an assumption that we're making?
yeah,
So first principles thinking, at its essence, is all about, just breaking down really complex problems into their fundamental components,
yep.
right? Stripping away all the assumptions, all the conventions. And you already did it, actually, when we were talking about, the saga with OpenAI and Sam Altman, right? You said, well, let's not make any assumptions, right?
Hmm.
But this is what we've heard about, right? And so, just by virtue of being aware of the fact that, well, it's an assumption, right? It may not be true. You're already applying some first principles thinking in your approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting discussion, Dhiren, because yeah, I always ask myself, why are startup founders obsessed with these first principles, right? And you nailed it. It's problem solving at the root. It's avoiding certain premises, and obviously avoiding just because of the way you've done things before doesn't mean you need to keep doing it. I like being that controversial founder, especially when you have your partners. You want to challenge each other's thinking all the time, right? So you can apply this to lots of different areas of the business. You could do it around innovation. You could do it around resource efficiency. When startups are operating with very limited resources, and understanding the core limitations of what physics had put in place. And that's where first principles come from, right? So the second law of thermodynamics, certain laws in physics,
Mm,
gravity, what goes up must come down, things like that, right? Or core aspects around differentiation in crowded markets. Thinking from first principles can definitely lead to unique solutions and products that can stand out. And this notion of change being a constant in anything that you do, a startup just needs to be constantly dynamic. So founders who think from first principles can essentially quickly adapt and pivot when they understand the fundamentals rather than just like these surface level facts. But I believe it was Elon that popularized it, right? He advocated these first principles, and just because they can serve as compelling reasons for other founders to adopt the approach, he used it to solve the battery problem in Tesla. He's using the same engineering problem solving ability in SpaceX. And so, yeah, it's super interesting how it got popularized, but I do feel it offers very, very sufficient, if not advanced critical thinking capabilities to startup founders or anybody that's trying to solve any kind of problem whatsoever.
since you brought up Nick, since you brought up Elon, let's touch on his algorithm. It's called his algorithm towards first principles, his thinking process and the framework, because I think it's a great and very simple framework on how he approaches first principles. So the first step, there are three steps to it. The first step is he identifies the fundamental truth. Like, what is the fundamental truth when it comes to this problem or this opportunity, right? So breaking down the problem into its most basic elements and really questioning the assumptions and the conventional wisdom around that. So you mentioned the battery problem, right? uh, the reason, or one of the reasons that he was able to overcome and solve the battery problem, is because they broke down the problem into its most basic elements. Or when it came to, I read Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon, and there was a scene in the book where he goes to Russia and they wanted to buy a rocket, right? And the Russians are like, "Who is this guy? Like, you want to buy a rocket?" And actually spat at him. Like, he got spat on. He was like, maybe that's just how they do business, but he got spat on. And on the flight back, right, he's like, look, maybe we should just build our own rocket. And he went into identifying each component that goes into the rocket and the cost, and literally pulled it up in an Excel spreadsheet and built it, and saw that, you know the cost of building a rocket from scratch was a fraction of the cost of actually buying a rocket. And, so he basically broke down the fundamental, or the problem, and identified the fundamental truth around pricing.
Yeah.
The second step, yeah,
No, go ahead. Keep going.
the second step was he breaks down the problem into smaller parts, right? So, kind of loosely tied to the first step, which is identifying the fundamental truth. So, he broke down the problem in, or breaks down the problem in smaller parts by dividing the problem into manageable chunks, right? Making it easier to analyze and address. Because now, if the problem is, let's say, you know this big, right? And I break it down into its fundamental parts, smaller parts, I'm able to really challenge some of the assumptions or the conventional wisdom in which I approach this problem, because now it's broken down to fundamental parts, right? Or smaller parts. The third step is synthesizing solutions from the ground up and combining the fundamental truth and insights to create new and innovative solutions. And that's where the innovation part really comes in. And Elon's a shining example of that, because he's done it across a number of different industries time and time again, right?
Yeah, I love that he calls it the algorithm because it is a step by step sequential process for breaking down problems into individual units that you can solve on their own, thus creating kind of this emergent property, right? And being able to solve for SpaceX's approach and kind of just building the rockets from the ground up. And I believe, what you said about conventional wisdom is really important here, right? There is an assumption about why was, Thomas Ford the last person, or Henry Ford rather, the last person to create an IPO in the automotive industry before Tesla, right? And it was because electric cars are just far too expensive for mass market due to the high cost of the batteries. And he did exactly that, right? So, his thinking was, okay, well, what are batteries made of? Well, the base materials like lithium, nickel, cobalt, and what do they cost in raw form? And then he asked
Mm,
himself that question, can production and design be optimized to reduce those costs? And ultimately, Tesla and among other companies that just followed suit, right? They wanted to innovate battery design at its very core, source the materials more directly, and then scale production to reduce those costs. And now they've become a success for all of those reasons.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. And you can apply this to, you know, any business, really. I mean, think of a small bakery. This is something that's close to home. Jasmine basically runs a small bakery from home. She loves to bake. She's very creative, and you know, our conversation always revolves around, okay, well, what are the fundamental truths, right, around this passion, right? Bakery being the primary, or the case study in this example, right? So what's the primary goal? Is it to generate profit, right? So goes to the first step, which is identifying the fundamental truth, right? Is it to generate profit, or is it for impact, or is it for passion? Like, just being really clear on what the fundamental truth is. And in this case, obviously, the fundamental truth is going to be the fundamental truth for the entrepreneur, for her in this case, right? Is it, is revenue generated by selling product, or is revenue generated by selling other things? I mean, in her case, it's basically a one product passion business, right? But in other businesses, there may be multiple products, right? So, what is the core product? Like, just really understanding what the fundamental truth is of the business.
Yeah.
And another fundamental truth is really understanding what the expenses are, right? To include everything from your labor, your overhead, your marketing, your time, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And the second step, yeah, go ahead.
No, no,
We'll
after you.
break down the second step. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say it's super interesting that there are very there were avid entrepreneurs that thought that they could get past first principles when you are kind of applying this thinking, but fail miserably or end up being fraudulent. And I'm thinking of Theranos as an example, right? Like the conventional wisdom at the time was medical testing that required specialized labs, which are, fundamentally time consuming, right? And then you kind of flip it and use a first principles approach and you say, okay, well, what's the goal of a medical test? And it's really to just detect the presence or absence of certain molecules and conditions. And then ultimately, it was the right approach, the right thinking. Can this process be either miniaturized or simplified using technology? But unfortunately, they made assumptions
Mm,
that, where the first principles just could not be, like, you can change your marketing campaign and you can tell a really, really good story, which is exactly what Elizabeth Holmes did. And she tried to reimagine blood testing, but she couldn't get past the first principles of, no, you actually can't do this in a miniaturized way to detect those specific molecules. You need to do a traditional lab, and you can't shorten that process. So it's like that's when gravity kind of gets a hold, and the second law of thermodynamics starts to take hold, right? And so you hit those limitations and those roadblocks.
yeah. But I mean, the law of thermal dynamics is a fundamental truth,
Right.
right? So did she go down to the fundamental truth,
Not
which
far
is
enough.
governed by physics? Yeah, not
Yeah,
far enough.
not far enough.
But to your point, I mean, you know, first principle doesn't guarantee success,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't. It's a valuable tool, but it doesn't guarantee success. And it's just one approach of many in the problem solving toolkit. And its effectiveness really depends on the problem and the context. And it
Absolutely.
also really depends on the understanding and the willingness of the entrepreneur or the team to really be very judicious with the process, right?
That's right.
Because it can be very time intensive, it can be resource intensive, right? Applying first principles thinking um, may require significant investment and resources. And not all problems require such an in-depth analysis, right? I mean, Jasmine's bakery passion business doesn't require it, right?
Yeah.
um, and in some cases it does, right? So it really, I mean, it may not be as practical to break everything down to its fundamental components in every situation, but attempting to really gives us insights into certain assumptions that we make, and it actually reveals our approach to how we think of problem solving and our approach as entrepreneurs.
Yes. Absolutely. I love that.
So since we were touching on the some of the counter arguments, what are some of the other, before we touch on the counter arguments, why don't we continue peeling the layers around the benefits of first principles? So, what other benefits? I mean, we spoke about creativity, right? We spoke about how this really brings about creativity um, in the business. We spoke about innovation, right? Because when you break through conventional thinking, it often leads to those incremental improvements, right? And first principles can really pave the way for revolutionary ideas and breakthroughs. It takes time, but it really is the access point to that incremental improvements. And I think, we spoke about Elon, who popularized this framework or this toolkit, but the Japanese have been doing it for decades,
Yeah.
especially in the automotive industry,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely.
Uh,
And so,
okay.
yeah, like, yeah, I mean, I could chime in here just because I think if you want to get like a little bit sciencey about it, right? Since we mentioned thermodynamics, if you think about kind of broad principles that can be applied to lots of different industries, right? So you talk about thermodynamics, the principle there is energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. That's actually the first law of thermodynamics. And so, how can you start to apply that, right? So, if you're a business and you're focused on some kind of energy or manufacturing, understanding energy efficiency, right? That applies to lots of different
mm,
things: energy conversion, waste management, resource allocation. It can lead to certain sustainable practices, cost savings, and scalability. So, obviously, solar plays a role in this, clean nuclear fusion, things like that, that people have been working on for a really long time. Companies might start to capture waste heat from one process to power another, right? And then you can start to apply these things across the board. So, how can you apply these sustainability factors so that you're not creating these materials or commercial goods for the public, but causing deforestation or ruining the topsoil or dead zones in oceans and things like that? You're actually improving overall efficiency through better manufacturing processes, right? One more example, I think, is around natural selection, right? Traits that have like some type of advantage are more likely to be passed on to subsequent generations or iterations that can be applied to different products, right? So if you're a business, you can apply this principle in product development, different types of marketing strategies, or organizational structures, right? So that's like, where do you think the beta test or the alpha to beta test comes from, right? You launch a software product in
mm,
market, you gain adoption for some features over others, and then next thing you know, that killer feature starts to gain receptivity and adoption in market. And then you start iterating with your customers. That app goes viral for whatever reason. And then now you can co create with your customers because the customers are now providing you with that additional insight so that you can go to market with something better. Now the customers have accessed that kind of demand, and you have that constant feedback loop. So I think natural selection is a good kind of edge case for agility and kind of this whole startup iteration that's caught so much fire, in terms of how you deploy stuff in market, iterate very, very quickly, ask for forgiveness later, ask for, forgiveness, not permission, and then break things very, very quickly. Sometimes you got to break a couple eggs to get an omelet. It's been just very well known in the
Mm.
startup space. So those things have scaled in principle over time, and have scaled very well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great point. Um, and I think that the case really can be made for first principles, and what we would, or our endeavor here is to have listeners, if you're an entrepreneur or not, it's to really understand how you can use first principles thinking in every aspect, in every facet of your life. I'll give you an example. So, as I mentioned to you before we started rolling, I had a retreat recently, just yesterday, as a matter of fact. And with all retreats, they when you're looking at signing up for a retreat, you're given the agenda. You're very clear as to what's going to happen, right? There's an itinerary. There's an agenda to what to expect on day one, what to expect on day two, right? Day three, however long the retreat is. And we decided that we were going to take a different approach. We were not going to be, um, we were not going to disclose for a number of reasons, and I'll share that shortly. But we were going to do something completely different. We were going to challenge the assumption that it needs to be shared with all attendees or prospective attendees. Because what we wanted to do was have people step into the unknown and not know exactly what they were going to get into. Because if I know what I'm going to get into, then it's predictable, and nothing really, no one changed in a space that is predictable, in a space that's known, in a space that's familiar. So we really wanted to give everyone an experience that was transformative. And so we did not share exactly what was going to be happening. And the feedback that we received at the retreat was overwhelming. That not knowing actually made them feel uncomfortable. And it already started changing their relationship with the unknown. And so before they even got to the retreat, they were already transforming just by virtue of not knowing, right? So we challenge that assumption that, okay, well, it's always been shared, but is that the only way, right?
Yeah.
Is that the only way?
Yeah.
And what we realize is that it's not, right? And there are some people that are going to be turned off by it, and there are some people that are going to embrace it, right? So by virtue of taking this approach, we are able to your point about self-selection, right? We were able, or they were able to self-select if this is something for them or not, right? And I believe that, I was sharing with you how I was just overwhelmed with the feedback, and I think that's part of it, is because they self-selected into something that, they were uncomfortable with it, but they started developing that comfort level of stepping into the unknown through, before they even got to the retreat.
I love that. I love that. And it makes me go, my mind also goes now back to other principles, because I'm like, okay, what are the I'm starting I'm
Let's
starting
go.
with first principles that I learned in like high school, right? We're talking physics like 101, like, and what was the one? I think it's Newton's third law, right? Like for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So in that case it was ultimately positive. You're saying that, let's not do things the way that we've always done before. Let's
Mm.
hold back some information and create the space for transformation, so that all of the attendees and participants have a much more fruitful experience, and you're kind of like indulging in kind of this mystery box effect. It can also have the opposite effect, right? So if there's an equal and opposite reaction, I go back to how we started the show, the episode with Sam Altman, right? There is definitely like the backlash, the opposite reaction from the employees, the stakeholder groups. Like anytime you put something in motion, you got to expect that you're going to have like an opposite reaction to that. And what's interesting about that is like they didn't go deep enough on that principle, and they didn't anticipate any of those stakeholders making significant strategic shifts, nor think about what would happen in terms of public perception, employees. And so yeah, that's a basic one, right? Newton's third law. Who wasn't thinking first principles then?
Absolutely.
So yeah, just wanted to
Yeah.
make that point there.
Yeah, you're right. And to just to build on that, I think you get an opposite reaction when you're not meeting expectation, or when there's an expectation and it's not addressed or it's not met, right? So the board in that case had an expectation, which again, assumption, right? Which he probably did not meet. Now, going back to the retreat, when we were asked, what's the agenda, right? We intentionally and very clearly said, you'll find out. We're not sharing. This is you stepping into the unknown. So there
Yeah.
was no opposite reaction to it, right? Because we met the expectation. We were very clear in the communication. We weren't trying to be covert, or were, uh, you know, we weren't trying to hold back information for the sake of holding it back. We were intentionally holding it back.
Yeah. Yeah. That is where it's very effective.
Yeah. Nix, let's get a little more tangible, right? Let's
Let's
try
do
to
it.
land the plane on first principle. Uh, So when I think of entrepreneurship and I speak to my friends who are entrepreneurs, one of the challenges that always comes up is declining sales, right? Or profitability for various reasons, right? Uh, so how would an entrepreneur who's looking to turn their business around use first principles in addressing that problem?
Okay. Yeah, I mean that one is fundamental to not just all startup entrepreneurs, but any mature business that's looking to
Yeah.
increase profitability and attract more customers and scale. And so I'm huge on data, so it first, a first principles approach always starts with the why, right? So if we
Mm.
break down that complex problem of what are all of the fundamental truths or building blocks around why you have declining sales? If you're talking about B2P enterprise sales, then look at your customer notes, right? Like, what was the reason for canceling this contract? What was the reason for canceling this MSA? Is it a specific feature? Was it not meeting specific needs? Was it those misaligned expectations? Was it not delivering on what you promised? Was it budget cuts? It would usually fall under,
Rising cost.
yeah, what is the
Yeah.
cost? Are you guys increasing your costs? All of
Yeah.
those things fall into the major why, right? So once you have the major why, you look to validate that assumption and saying, okay, we have a small subset of customer data that says, you have a percentage of customers that canceled because of cost cutting and budgeting. You have another because they have unfulfilled expectations by the product, and then another for like random X or Y reasons. Maybe they didn't like their sales rep, or some frustration with the product, so forth and so on, right? In B2C, it's a lot better because you can get that data at scale. And when you leave notes as to why you canceled, you have surveys that you could drop very, very quickly. Churn, you're kind of seeing the needle move right away. So once you have that data, now you can operationalize, right? And you're going in there without any assumptions whatsoever. You have to avoid that. And then obviously now you can get into problem solving mode, right? Is this a resource
Okay,
problem?
hold on,
Yeah,
before we go into problem solving
yeah,
mode. So you identified the why,
that's
which
right.
is essentially identifying the challenge,
That's right.
identifying the problem,
That's right.
right? And so from that step, you've identified, let's say, three or four areas that could be the catalyst or the impetus to that challenge,
Hmm.
or those are the reasons that sales could be declining, profitability could be declining. Now, what's the next step?
Yeah.
Once you've identified it,
Uh,
you said problem solving. So you're now breaking down the problem.
so there's one more. I'm going to roll that back a little bit just because there's one more thing there, right? So you're probably seeing this all
Okay.
around, and this is common across lots of different industries, especially when you're working in very a product led growth, high growth space where you're constantly trying to stack on lots of new products and lines of revenue and things like that, and you're just trying to continuously add incremental. You're seeing different things operate at a more fundamental level, such that you're seeing budget cuts happen, you're seeing the whys, but then there's something up that you're not seeing. But then you look at the market conditions, you look at where the market is it up or down? Overall, people are cost cutting. Then you attribute that to something macro, right? You're like, well, this is just not the
Mm.
right environment. And that's also a first principle, right? Because this is out of your control at some level. The environment is dictating supply and demand, and you have to cut budgets because everybody's cutting budgets. And so that becomes kind of like a fundamental first principle that's foundational to how you go about solving that problem. So now you're right.
I just want to add, just put a pin on the
Yeah.
end,
Yeah.
and that's a great point.
Yeah.
It's a great point because entrepreneurs that are successful in pivoting, we've seen a number of different very successful pivots, is because they got to the fundamental truth and they understood that they've bumped into a problem that is actually a fundamental truth governed by something that was beyond their
That's
control.
right.
And by virtue of that, they pivoted the business,
Yes.
right? As
Yeah.
opposed to entrepreneurs who are not clear on what is beyond their control or what is a fundamental truth governed by physics or limits, and they continue going down that path,
Mhm.
and it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to make
I
that
love that.
point.
When you actually softballed the next point to go into problem solving mode, right? And I'll continue with either a B2B enterprise that's losing profitability in one line, yet still has
Mm,
some R&D budget that they could open up something new, right? So in any sector, you're going to have budget cuts based on your core line of business. But what is the number one industry that's exploding within tech? It's AI, right? You look at the commoditization of data management, the commoditization of cloud architecture and infrastructure and management. You look at the price of consumption models to manage infrastructure. All of these are now serverless. You could do this completely in the cloud, right? So Moore's law will continue to impact that, and that's not going to change. That is a fundamental principle that the
mm,
number of transistors you could squeeze on an integrated circuit will continue to drive the price performance of computation down. Therefore, you could pretty much place a bet that if you create a new product line and you start to envision something better with your data, push those into AI machine learning models, then you could probably create a new product fairly quickly and at cost. So it's not the time to kind of double down on where you're getting your data from in terms of like the features or the products or the platforms that you've launched. Maybe it's time to explore something new. So that just drawing the connection between the example that you had mentioned, it's time to pivot for those reasons.
mm,
Let's not look at the shrinking macro environment. Let's look at an environment or category where there's explosive growth and align that to our core competencies, make that our own. And then perhaps it's time to endeavor on a new product line and see if we could get some revenue that way.
mm. Excellent. Okay. What happens next once we do the problem solving and we get to the fundamental truth? We start rebuilding, we start changing the approach because clearly there's something that we're doing, or in this case, the entrepreneur who is seeing their revenue decline, their profitability decline, the approach that they're taking is just not working, right? So they've identified the problem, right? Now, let's say the problem is cost or sales and customer loss,
Mhm.
right? Now they rebuild the approach with a different approach based on fundamental truths that are either governed by the market, physics, Moore's law,
Yeah.
and they start identifying how they can change or how customer preferences could be potentially changing, and analyze specific customers that are leaving and perhaps adjust their approach to how they engage with those customers.
Yes, exactly. So you're basically creating more value out of a new orientation of a product, whether that's reorienting your supply chain or getting new raw materials from someplace else, thus bringing your costs down, or perhaps it's restructuring your organization. Perhaps that means, um, you know, letting go of a certain organization that isn't performing as well. So those are the natural shifts that start to take place based on the data that you have, but it's based on first principles thinking, right? What's under your control? What are the things that you can modify that won't disrupt the business too much? And if you're kind of down onto kind of your last leg, then and you need to disrupt the business, what are some pretty dramatic shifts that you can make and essentially endeavor on a new product line or a new orientation of the business that might get more profitability?
Mm. One of the challenges that I've experienced firsthand when it comes to taking a first principles approach is is the team. It's people. Like convincing stakeholders and team members to, you know, adopt first principles thinking can be met with a lot of resistance, right? Because although it's a simple, very practical solution, or approach, I should say, in their mind, there's already an approach that we're doing. We're taking this approach, albeit not working, but change is really difficult, right? And the first response, the natural response to change is to resist it.
Yeah.
So this is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen. I mean, going back to Elon, for example, when he bought Twitter, which is now called X, uh, he saw that there were 2,000 engineers at Twitter, 2,000, while there were 200 engineers at Tesla. And then went on that rampage of basically just letting, a number of different layoff. I think there were 3 or 4 rounds. And he approached it using first principles, right? The whole approach was based on first principles. He asked a fundamental question: why is it that we are able to build, uh, a, a automotive company that is driven by AI with 200 engineers, while this company has 2,000 engineers? Right? What is it that they're putting out? And so then he went into, okay, how many lines of code does Twitter write? The engineers, the 2,000 engineers, how many lines of code do they write relative to how many lines of code do Tesla engineers write? And it just kept peeling the layers until we got to the bedrock of the fundamental truth in that case, which was, are we overstaffed, right? Do we need to cut costs to really turn, this company around?
Yeah, that one's a great example too, right? And obviously that one's a little bit controversial too because there are different metrics to measure success, right? So if it's resource efficiency, he's definitely winning that game, but there's probably disparity in opinion in terms of how successful the platform is from a free speech perspective. Yes, absolutely. You broke down like one of the biggest psyops in modern history when it comes to digital platforms, and but you're also losing a lot of advertising revenue at the same time, and there's like a lot of political maneuvering that tends to move outside of the first principles camp, I think, and moves into the far more complex sociology and market psychology of how people react to certain corporate decisions and how you're making those transformations. So yeah, but that one continues to be a very, very interesting business case.
Let's say it's the number of people or the number of engineers. Let's just go with that example for a moment, right? The number of engineers in the team. He said, they cut, I think, something to the tune of 85 or 90% of the engineers. He said at the end of it, if we don't have to add things back, right, then we didn't cut deep enough.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that for a moment, right? If you take that approach in all aspects, right? Because then you get really close to that equilibrium, potentially. Yes, controversial, and really every situation is different. But when we're looking at, efficiency of, an engineering team, right? With that approach of let's cut, probably more, possibly more than what we should, but then we can always add back.
Yeah.
Yes, there's blowback. There's a lot of, you know first and second order consequences to that approach, but he's taking first principles maybe to another level. He probably should redefine first principles, uh, because he's added his own flavor to it. But
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see and witness,
Absolutely.
because these are real life case studies, right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
we use these products.
Right.
Okay, so Nick's going back to the steps. You said identify the why, right?
That's right.
Ask the question why. Identify the challenge, and then you said to break down the problem, right? So you can start getting into problem solving mode, right? And then what follows that is rebuilding the approach.
That's right.
And we
It's
spoke about some resistance.
Mhm.
You're going to get resistance from your team because this requires change.
Yeah.
You may have to bring in new expertise. You may have to pivot the business. But challenging, when you ask the question why, and you go by a clean slate and delete all the assumptions that you've made in the past, which is what we started off with, right? I mentioned that, this is something that makes me cringe when I hear, but this is how we've always done it,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And that's the biggest part of avoiding the assumption is that just because you've done it before, make sure that it's not make sure that you reinstill good muscle memory instead of just an archaic or rigid process, right? And the only thing I'll add to that is I love steel manning an approach when you're looking for problem solving at the very root. And that means exhausting all potential possibilities, right? And you could even put quantum
Mm.
principles into this, right? Let's exhaust everything everywhere all at once, and let's explore every potential scenario, and let's go down the path of exploring which one is the best. And look at it right now. We're in this moment of time, and we are collapsing a wave function such that we can have the very best decision based on all of the potential paths that we can go down. And then let's steelman that approach to know and ensure that this is the right path that we're going down to solve that specific problem, whether it getting more profit, reissuing and reorienting our business, or cost cutting from that perspective to be more efficient, or launching a new product, whatever that is.
Mm. Beautiful. And let's now talk about emergence theory as we wrap up, and how this ties into emergence theory. There's a very close integrated relationship between first principles and emergence theory. So picture this. It's like, imagine you're looking at a puzzle, right? And you break down the puzzle. It's a jigsaw puzzle. You break down to its individual pieces, right? And when you're looking at the individual pieces, it may not seem significant, but we know what those pieces together can bring, right? But when we put it together, it creates this mesmerizing whole. But is that the only way it can be put together? So when you break it down to its fundamental truths, down to its singular components, how else can this be put together for a new emergence, something new, a new approach, a new way of doing things, a new way of thinking, whatever the facet may be, right? It could be nutrition. It could be, a retreat. It could be how you think about AI in your company, right? Or how you parent, for example, right? So it really applies to all facets of life.
Yeah, I love that you brought that. With there's lots of profound insights that you can have from like complex systems and patterns, and you're absolutely right. It's like it's are you seeing kind of this overarching view from these complex patterns, and it offers such a valuable framework for understanding the power of self organization and adaptability, right? And so, what are some of those core things there, right? You talked about startup agility. We talked about innovation and creativity. When you're in flow and you have access to these different flow states, you can come up with that aha moment, right? Networked intelligence. So emergence theory draws from like the connections of all of these different facets that come together. What else? Like resilience and robustness, and then obviously, having that kind of customer centricity and that awareness and cognizance of what the market demands and what your users demand. And I think those are some more of kind of like the applications of emergence as it relates to first principles.
Nikos, that ties in and wraps everything up very, very, very well. It's crystallized in my mind. I find after this conversation, I have this, um, you know, even more motivation to start looking at every facet of my life from that lens,
Yeah, same.
from the lens of first principles, the fundamental truths.
Love it.
All right. We'll speak soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to Emergence Now, where we explore the emerging trends, technologies, and ideas that are shaping our world today for you to discover yourself. We hope you enjoyed this episode and gained valuable insights that you can apply in your own life. If you want to stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we share additional content, engage with our community, and keep the conversation going. Thanks again for listening to Emergence Now, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode.